Good afternoon and welcome to this workshop here at ELF, and this workshop's on developing mentoring relationships, and it's great to join with you. There's people still gathering, and this workshop's designed to help you think a little bit about how you could either begin mentoring others in your own life or else to develop a network of mentoring relationships perhaps in your church as well. Just a quick overview of what we're going to try to do together. We're going to, first of all, I'm going to try to attempt to define mentoring or to give some sort of a definition of mentoring. And we'll also think about some of the fears or the myths and the benefits that some people might have. So first of all, I'll attempt to define mentoring and we'll think about that. Secondly, we'll look at where we see mentoring in the Bible. Do we see mentoring in the Bible? Where do we see mentoring relationships? And what might we learn from that? Thirdly, we'll think about some practical ways that we can begin mentoring or doing this ourselves. And lastly, I'm going to share a couple of resources that might be useful in mentoring younger Christians as well. I do warn that both of those are in an Irish context, but hopefully they might be useful to some, or even give some ideas of what helpful resources might look like. Just as a way of introduction, my name's Rick Hill, and I am based here just outside Belfast in Northern Ireland. And I work for a denomination here in Ireland, the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. It's a network of about 500 churches. And my role is called discipleship development. So really my role is to develop training and resources that will help churches to develop in their discipleship of others. I'm married to Sarah with two little boys here in the house, Noah, who's 7, and Micah is 2, and they've just gone out a walk to give me a little bit of peace, so that they shouldn't be interrupting. But I would say lockdown has we've both been enduring and enjoying lockdown with those boys over the last few weeks. So let me get started, and let's think together a little bit about defining mentoring. I guess for me, mentoring can be defined in lots of different ways. This isn't a right definition, this is just my definition. And I describe it as walking closely with a less mature Christian by inviting them into our lives and investing in them through regular conversation, through guided reading and prayer. I like those words, inviting and investing. So we're inviting someone to come close to us. We'll think about that a little bit later. And we're investing in them. So it's not just aimless conversation or chat, but actually it's developing them and trying to invest in them to see them grow. And sometimes in the church, I think we're good at saying to people, listen to me. But I would be far more hopeful in the future of the church if we instead said to people to walk with me. So not just listen to me, but walk with me. And I love this phrase, walk with me, because essentially I think that's what mentoring is all about. It's about an older believer coming alongside a younger believer and inviting them to walk with us. And whether this is on a one-on-one basis or through smaller group intentional discipleship, I think mentoring is a key tool for spiritual formation. And we'll explore both the kind of one-on-one dynamic and also the smaller group mentoring that can happen as well. I think it's really important to state at the start, as we define mentoring, that it's about people and not just programs. We want to think today about how we can develop mentoring relationships that seep deep into people's lives. I once heard someone describe mentoring as content-full relationship, and I really like that. So it's not less than relationship, but it's also more than relationship too. And I love this quote from Robert Coleman. He says this: one must decide where he wants his life to count. In the momentary applause of popular recognition, or in the reproduction of his life in a few people who will carry on his work after he is gone. It's a question of which generation we are living for. The reproduction, investing in others, inviting them close. And I've personally experienced this. A number of older Christians who have been examples to me or who've invested in me, some in formal mentoring relationships, some informally. But I think of an older Christian who I met on a mission team who showed me what it meant to be a man who served God, and he met with me regularly for lunches after that team, long after that team, on a regular basis. I don't think he would have described himself as my mentor, but he took an interest in me and was intentional about meeting with me to do that. I think of a youth leader of mine who gave me opportunities to serve. And even when I didn't have a clue, he then sat down with me afterwards to debrief, to share how that went. And he brought me and a small group of leaders in our church into his home. I think of a local church elder who brought together a group of young musicians, and he converted his garage into a place that we could play our music and to learn to pray and worship, and he did that alongside us. And it's thanks to these people, George and Tim and Dave, that I discovered what it meant to follow Jesus, and I was shaped and influenced in my faith. I think we need others. We need others. So I've seen the benefit of mentoring in my own life. I've also seen it in the lives of others. In my previous work before this, I spent a decade in youth ministry. And several years ago, we set up a mentoring program in my church, which saw around 20 teenagers meet regularly with an older Christian, and saw many of them grow spiritually through these relationships. It was this older generation investing in a younger generation. And I have this picture of how an older generation perhaps needs to humble ourselves and get on our knees and step closer to a younger generation of faith. I think of my dad, who is retired. He's a well-educated man. He's in his late 60s. And yet he spends a couple of days every week on his hands and knees on the floor, playing with trains with our 2-year-old. It's about an older generation stooping low, humbly stepping closer to a younger generation to invest in them. I'm sure my dad could do lots of better things with his time, or lots of things that are more on his level, but he chooses to humble himself and come close and get on his knees. I think that's what we need. That's a picture for us to carry with us. So what I want to do is maybe hear some of your thoughts, some of your myths or fears or benefits, some of the things that exist around mentoring that maybe might hold us back. So if you continue to pop them into the Q&A box, that will be brilliant. I'll share some of them, and I'll share some of my own thoughts as well. Someone said, Anthony said, one benefit I see is that it gives the opportunity for the one being mentored to see the Christian life lived out in a practical way, and it creates a relationship of trust for asking questions and seeking honest answers. I think that's really important to see that benefit. I think it's not just about explanation, it's about demonstration. I think there's a myth that you have to be really old to be a mentor. I don't think age is an indicator. I think spiritual maturity is. So all I think you need to be is maybe one step further down the road of faith than someone else. I think there's a myth that no one has enough time for mentoring, and I think actually it can be flexible. I think that's the beauty of mentoring, that people can mentor in a way that maybe fits with their lives. They may not be able to sign up to a church program at the same time every week, but actually to mentor someone and meet with them on a monthly basis or fortnightly basis at a time flexible to them, that's possible. I think another myth or fear is that only those being mentored benefit from it. A mentor themselves is often very blessed by these interactions. And I think there is a myth that maybe mentoring is all about sharing deep and personal information. I think it can be that, but I think if we set it up like that, it could also scare people off. And so I prefer to talk about, this is about spiritual formation. It's about walking the Christian life with someone. And so you don't have to share deep and personal information. Certainly initially in the relationship, it might develop and get to that place. So perhaps the term mentoring seems daunting, but in reality, I think mentoring is a fairly simple strategy. It's simply walking alongside a less mature Christian. So some of the benefits, I think it's flexible. I've mentioned that. It doesn't need to be a specific or set time every week, although that might help. It doesn't require lots of people to be available. It can happen one-on-one or in twos and threes. It can be done in over a cup of coffee in public or in a living room in private. And it utilizes different gifts and abilities in the body of Christ. Those who are really good relationally really flourish in a mentoring environment. And you don't need a cool venue or lights or a big sound system. It simply means setting this time aside. I think it crosses generational boundaries. Again, I come back to the analogy of my dad on his hands and knees with a toddler. Mentoring can empower an older generation to invest in a young generation. Maybe older people in the church may not think they have enough energy to serve a younger generation or to help out in a youth club or a youth group. People might not feel cool enough or confident enough to speak at the front, but they could spare a few hours to have conversations. So I think it crosses generations. It allows and enables an older generation to share some of their lessons of faith. And I think it's intentional. It's focused on deepening and developing someone's faith. It's not about engaging or entertaining people. It's about equipping them. And what could be more beneficial for a young Christian than to open the Bible and pray and share their life with an older Christian who is further down the road? So where do we see this in the Bible? Do we see this in the Bible? I see it as early in the Bible as the example of Jethro and Moses in Exodus 18, where we're told that Moses listened to Jethro and did everything he said. Jethro passed on advice to Moses. He told him that what he was doing, the way he was going about his leadership, wasn't healthy, and he advised him. And it was Moses who was going to be taking those decisions. It was Moses who was actioning and leading. But Jethro, from a different viewpoint or perspective, brought wisdom to Moses along the way. We think of that mentoring relationship of Elijah and Elisha. 2 Kings 2 is where we can see that best. But where Elijah was passing on the mantle, Elisha was alongside him at different times, and then he passed on the mantle to him. Also see it with Naomi and Ruth, in Ruth chapter 1, in the early part of that amazing story. And we see it in Mordecai and Esther, as Mordecai advised Esther in how she was to lead in a very challenging situation. In the New Testament too, we see Paul instruct Timothy. Timothy 2:2 says that Paul was teaching the truths to trustworthy people who would in turn pass them on to others. And it's clear that Paul was with Timothy. He was in proximity, close to his young disciple, and he was now encouraging him to go and do the same. And we also see mentoring in the way that Jesus made disciples. He didn't stay at a distance, but he got close and he got personal and involved with those that he led. And there was a method to Jesus' discipleship. I was thinking about this earlier with the disciple-making leadership network. And we thought about how actually Jesus invested in a few. He appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach. And so there's this idea of Jesus investing in just a few. And while he could have gathered and attracted a large crowd, he actually went beyond that. He could have filled stadiums and toured the world and drawn crowds, but Jesus chose to invest in a small group of people who went on to impact the world. And I think these are 5 numbers that are associated with the ministry of Jesus. You know, he did feed the 5,000. He did teach the crowds. He sent the 72 out on mission. He appointed 12. Within the 12, there's these 3, Peter, James, and John, who he was with even more than the rest. And then up a mountain or early in the morning, at the other side of a lake, Jesus is alone with his Father in prayer. And as we read the Gospels, we see Jesus making a movement from the crowd to the 12, and from the 12 to the few, and from the 3 to being alone with his Father. And I think there's a temptation in ministry and church to walk the opposite direction, to leave the place of prayer, to abandon proximity to people, and just seek to build it bigger, to get more people. But actually, the ironic thing is that Jesus did the opposite. He invested in a few for the benefit of the many. And if whatever you do ever feels small, mentoring sometimes feels small. It's just one person or it's just a small little group of people. And maybe we're tempted to think that it's not that significant. But just because it's small doesn't mean it's insignificant in the kingdom of God. So what if each of us today could go on in the rest of this year and invest in one individual over the next year? What if we could meet with them and be a role model to them and read the Bible and pray with them? It probably won't attract much attention, but away from publicity or away from the spotlight, to really invest deep in a younger believer. And then what if they went on to do the same? What if they invested in someone themselves and you continue to do the same with someone else? You see, it's the picture of multiplication, the idea of the kingdom of God growing as we invest in a few to benefit many, as we draw alongside people who will be maybe future pastors or future elders in the church or future teachers or business leaders in society or doctors or authors or parents. How might we be able to invest in their lives now to shape them for their future and their future leadership? It's about investing in a few to benefit the many. But it's also important to note in Mark 3 here that Jesus appointed 12, but he was actually with them, that he might be with them. And Jesus was demonstrating that disciple making, mentoring was done up close. He didn't just give them a class to sign up to, but actually he shared his life. He didn't just teach them from the front, but he modeled his life along side by side along the way, not just a talking head from a distance, but a living example up close. With Jesus, it wasn't just come and see, but it was come and be with me. So how much are we actually spending time actually being with people beyond the programs, beyond the formal responsibilities of church life? Mentoring involves open lives and open hands and open homes and sharing our lives as well. Again, it's about people more than programs. How can we get alongside people more? But also Jesus challenged them. He didn't let the disciples just stay static or stay where they were. He was appointing them and being with them that he might send them out. In other words, it was about transformation in their lives. He didn't just say, come follow me and I'll look after you. He said, come follow me and I'll make you, I'll shape you and I'll change you. Mentoring should always involve challenge. If not, it's just a social conversation or it's friendship. But our goal shouldn't be just to create nicer Christians, but to launch active missionaries. We need to send people out. And so for a moment, I'd just love you to reflect on these couple of questions. I wonder who you can be investing in. Who's your 3? Who's even your 12? But how could you be investing in them? And how could you be stepping closer to them? Perhaps on an informal basis, just as you go about your life. Or maybe perhaps in a more intentional way of inviting someone into a mentoring relationship, or maybe even in your church as you lead. If you lead in church life, to think about actually how you could establish a scheme like this. I'm going to think a little bit practically now about how we might either get started or continue or keep going in mentoring. And I'm going to give you, I think, 8 top tips. We're going to think really practically here, 8 top tips on how we could do this. And just maybe a brief bit as we begin about how I personally mentor or how I personally do this. I either mentor individually or in small mentoring groups. I found the one-to-one format really useful in the past, and it's a great way of accompanying a young believer. So there's, I'll talk about Ethan. Ethan's a young leader in our church. He was a student and last year began to lead one of the kids ministry programs in our church. And it was quite a significant step of leadership for him as a young 21-year-old. So I wanted to invest in his spiritual growth. And so just informally, it wasn't part of the program in church. I just invited him to come to our small group which happens fortnightly in our home. That's how it began. I said, come along there because you're giving out lots in your leadership. So I'd love for you to be in an environment where you're growing with others as well. So he came along and he's been connecting there over the last year. And then I also offered them, once kind of relationship was established and he was part of that community, I then asked him or invited him to meet with me once a month on his own for a coffee or for a lunch, and we chat things through together. Sometimes I encourage him to maybe read a chapter of a book, because he's brought up an issue, and I said, here's something you might read, and then we'll discuss it together. Sometimes I ask him to bring me a couple of questions that he's been thinking about in his leadership. I regretted doing this one time because he came with a whole A4 page of 11 questions that he wanted to chat through. So he's quite keen and has appetite. Sometimes we read a Bible passage and pray, or sometimes we just catch up and I hear about some of the challenges in his life or in his leadership. But it is intentional. There was a clear invite from me to him, but it's also informal and it's flexible as well. But in the past 5 years, I've also each year tried to develop a mentoring group, one each year, normally with students or young leaders who I invite to meet together with me. This is a bit more fixed and formal, but it's still, I try to keep it still personal and relational, where I choose or invite up to about 5 people to meet over a set period. And I find this approach really good in people learning not just off me as a mentor, so that it's not just the pressure of what you learn from me, but actually they'll learn off one another too. And that creates a little bit of energy, particularly with in a younger generation or in a student generation, young adult generation. And I've gone through some content with them together. So here's 8 steps that I think about as I establish either of those types of mentoring relationships. The first is identify and invite. Practically, when I'm launching one of these groups, or even just as I look around and think I have capacity or time for this, I think, who has appetite for this? Who is hungry for more in their faith? Or who needs intentional investment? So maybe a brand new believer or someone who's come through one of the evangelistic courses. Our church runs Alpha, so if someone comes to faith through Alpha, I'm thinking, right, that's someone someone needs to invest in anyway. So I look around, who has appetite for this? Who's hungry for more? Who needs investment? Who do I have a good connection with? And I think that's important, actually. It's kind of the chemistry word. Who responds well to you or me, and then once I've identified some people, then I invite them. I would start with a general invitation, giving rough info about the idea or the concept without maybe being too specific about the meeting times. And then generally people come back to me and say if they're interested or not, and then I'll follow up with specific arrangements. And sometimes I actually just like to give a short-term commitment initially. I say something like, let's meet for 6 times and see how it goes. Or let's meet for the whole way through this term, and then at Christmas, we'll reconsider and see if we want to continue. And I find that this is quite a good way of getting started. It's setting a little bit of a lower bar, and then usually I find that as it grows and develops, people have appetite for more. I think if you're thinking about going wider with this in a church context, then identifying a group of more spiritually mature people who could invest like this in the lives of those less mature, I think then you want to invite potential mentors along to a vision night to find out more, or a training night to equip them to do it. And I've developed actually a mentoring video to help cast vision for this if you're interested. So I'll pop that in the chat a little bit later on, the link to that. So identify and invite, regular routine. I think it's helpful to decide on a regular routine for your meetings or for your group. And your routine could be weekly over a short period. Some people really like that weekly dynamic. I don't think it has to be. I think it's just more important that it's regular, so fortnightly or monthly throughout the year, something that will be repeatable and consistent. So making it the same time and venue helps me for it to become a regular routine in my life, and it's easier for others to schedule as well. So whatever routine works for you, and it can give consistency. I'd encourage you, and this is coming back on what we thought about at the very start, to pursue relationship. Always think person before program. So, as you meet, find out what's going on in their lives. Ask them questions before you dive into a resource or content, or even do what you want to do. Find out what's going on. Listen to people. Ask them what's going on in their work or life or home life or family or ministry. And as you get to know people that you're mentoring, you might find that they have a lot on their plate at that moment. I think that's where you can be flexible. So you might want to ease back the commitment. Or if they're struggling with an issue that the content isn't just covering, then take time to talk about that and explore that. I think pursuing a relationship means connecting with them outside the meetings. It's not just about a weekly meeting or whenever. So touch base with them during the week, call them to see how something's going, drop them a text to encourage them. It doesn't mean constant contact, but just pursuing a relationship, praying for them as well, asking how you can pray for them and doing that. It's whole life discipleship rather than a program. So look for social opportunities and have a meal with them or invite them to join you in something they're doing. I can think of a young man who I wasn't actually formally mentoring him, but he had just been around me in some of the things that I've been doing. And he contacted me at one point at a particular time of crisis in his life. And looking down the diary for my week, it didn't look very hopeful of when I might get a chance to connect with him other than a phone call. But that evening, I happened to be going speaking somewhere. And he rang me in the morning. We're having this conversation. And I just said to him, I'm driving an hour to this place tonight to speak. Do you want to come with me? And he was able to come. And he came along. And we were able to have a conversation on the way there. And I don't know whether what we did took his mind off things, but we were all able to have a conversation in the car on the way back. And we grabbed food on the way back too. And actually, for me at that point, I was trying to pursue relationship and add things in as well. I think it's important to choose content. I believe in using a resource and basing your mentoring on it. I don't think that has to mean like a heavy curriculum, like a 3-year curriculum, but I think it's helpful to choose some sort of content so that it avoids becoming just like an aimless conversation or too general after a while. I think it also helps to have some content then that you can reflect on together. So you're reflecting on kind of a third party. And so it's not just, here's what I think as a mentor, but let's read this together and learn together. And then my role is actually helping to tease out some of the learning and some of the application through that. I think your content can be a range of things. I think that might be a discipleship resource that you could pick up, and I'll share a couple of these towards the end. I think it could be just a good Christian book that you read together and say, let's read this, and you read a chapter this week and we'll talk about it together. It could be working through a Bible book. The Gospel of Mark can be read in 16 weeks or 16 sessions, a chapter a week. I think flexibility is important, but having some sort of content to base your conversations on. And remember the quote from earlier, mentoring is content-filled relationships. I think this also helps as well because you're going beyond your meeting as well. So you're stimulating them with content throughout the week. You are giving them things to follow up on, and then it means your conversation can have a launch pad each time. So rather than sitting down and opening, and your opening question could be, tell me what you've learned from what you read this week, or what challenged you. Let's talk about that. What do you want to explore more? What confused you in your beginning there? I believe in setting the bar high from the start. I think it's about creating healthy rhythms, and it's easier to start with the bar high and lower it when needed, or lower it over time, than start easy and try to raise expectations. So that's why I think it's good to start the way you want to continue. So that's why I generally don't do like 4 or 5, let's do 4 or 5 social group meetings and then try to introduce the Bible somewhere along the line. I think that's really difficult to do. I think it's better to start the way you want to continue and then introduce the kind of social elements as you go to develop the relational side. I think it's important to set your expectations from the start as well, so that you are wanting people to arrive at your meetings on time, or to read the content beforehand, or that uh, this is an environment where you want to encourage spiritual growth and set the bar high. I had a bit of it wasn't a disaster, but I can remember mentoring a teenager years ago, and he got really annoyed with me on our third or fourth meeting together when I offered a little bit of challenge or criticism to him. And he was appalled at this and said, I thought I could tell you anything. And I reflected on it later on that actually maybe I was the issue there, that I hadn't told him. I just talked about, let's hang out and meet up and chat. And I hadn't set that expectation that actually I wanted to help him grow and challenge him in his faith. I think setting the bar high also means including prayer in that from the outset, or as close to the outset as possible. If you're in a public place, it might not mean a long prayer session, but even just you taking a lead and praying for someone at the end of a meeting can set the bar high. I think it's important to mix it up and have flexibility. You don't need to follow the resource every single week, or you could just meet for a week to enjoy food and chat together. That's okay. Or you could read the same book together and chat about what you're learning for a period, and then maybe for another season you could do something completely different. Or you could, rather than having a formal conversation, you could attend an event together, or you could send your mentee a video to watch, a sermon to listen to, and then discuss it together. I think it's important to try to mix it up as well. You could even mix up the venue for freshness and bringing people to your home if applicable, or if possible. I think that changes the dynamic. And I think especially for young men, I think sometimes we think that everything has to happen in a coffee shop or in a home setting, but going a walk or doing an activity. I wonder if young men particularly, but people sometimes share more when they're walking shoulder to shoulder than when they're looking face to face. And so how could you do that? I can again think of a young lad in our youth group who, again, I wanted to have a kind of pastoral conversation with, and I knew he would find it difficult to open up. So I took him to play a game of pool. And just as I was taking my shots, I asked him some questions, or I got him to share more, and he seemed to open up more in that environment when he wasn't looking directly into my eyes. So consider that. Take him on a shopping trip, take him on an adventure, whatever it is, and mix it up. I think the art, or part of the art of mentoring, is asking good questions. I think we need to avoid the temptation to commentate on everything. So I don't think people always need our advice, but they may need our questions that will help them to process it. So don't feel the pressure to always have or give advice. At times, advice will be really useful, but at the right time. So rather than always giving advice, ask good questions. Open questions are good questions. So not sort of yes or no questions, but if you're looking at a Bible passage, what do you learn from Peter's response here? Is a great question. Or rather than here's what I would do, ask if you were in that situation again, what might you do? And those are two very different things. So someone's talking about a challenging situation they're facing in their work, rather than saying here's what I'll do. You say, if you the next time you're in that situation at work, what might you do? Or what could you do that would be helpful? Or how could you honor Christ in this particular challenge? Asking good questions. And it's following Jesus' example and asking good questions. Also, when we ask good questions, people feel listened to. So asking follow-up questions, it shows that you're interested in them. It shows that you're listening to them. And it also helps to clarify confusion. So asking clarifying questions like, was this just a one-off mistake, or is this a regular pattern in your life? You're going to deal with those two things very differently if it's a one-off mistake than actually if there's a kind of regular sinful pattern. Or why do you think you responded like that whenever you snapped angrily at whoever? Why do you think you responded? Well, if someone's tired, or if someone is a very different response than if someone thinks very lowly of the person that they're dealing with. Or what have you learned from that experience? Or again, that question, what would you do differently the next time? A great question. I love that question of what are you learning through this experience, as well. So ask good questions. And the last part of this practical and part of this session as well is to get them to lead something. I think mentoring isn't just about us doing everything ourselves, but it's about allowing them to use their gifts and skills, allow them to minister to you. It shouldn't all be one-way traffic. And so next week you might say, I want to talk about humility next week. So what I'd love you to do is read Philippians 2, and could you bring your thoughts to share with me? Or could you bring your thoughts to share with this group you're going to lead next week? And it pushes them out of their comfort zone. Or could you share something that encourages, whatever it is, that allow them, and you might even, if it's a coaching and leadership mentoring dynamic, you might then want to offer them some feedback or encourage them about how that's helped them, or how that's helped you as well. So offering them feedback is really, really good. I actually think that's something in maybe in church life and certainly in leadership development and in mentoring, we don't offer enough feedback to people as well. It maybe takes a little bit of bravery and courage on our part, but again, if you're setting that expectation, that can be really helpful. So get them to lead something.